Oh, hello there. Yeah, I know I look a little different, but I figured that's appropriate given how this McGTV Top 10 will be focusing on 10 animated series that I've seen in their entirety and can wholeheartedly recommend to anyone of any age or demographic as not just great displays of design work and art, but great displays of storytelling and very in-depth character development. Before we get into it, please note that these are shows that have, to this date at least, completed their series run and are available to view in their entirety. The Tick. I've been following this property way back to the original comic books created by Ben Enlund, all the way through this incarnation, the Patrick Warburton, Seinfeldish type show, and to the most recent reboot on Amazon. And every incarnation works in its own way, but for me, it's this mid-90s animated version of The Tick that really stays in the memory longest. This show just knew how to get it right when it came to making a satire of the superhero genre. It plays very well with the tropes of comic book superheroes and adds unique and absurd new twists to them. Starting right away with the big blue protagonist himself, this nigh invulnerable, dense, but still noble character. The scenarios are preposterous, the villains are outlandish and grotesque at times, and his sidekick is a cowardly everyman. But in the reality of this world, everything works so well. Much in the same way the tongue-in-cheek style worked for the '66 Batman series. I feel I could recommend this show not only to younger viewers who might just need something a little bit lighter and less gritty than recent superhero outings, but also to older viewers who would appreciate the outlandish lampooning they're clearly going for in this show. Sonic the Hedgehog, more specifically the Saturday morning version that the fanbase has come to know as Sonic Sat AM. I glimpsed here and there episodes from the other incarnations such as Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog and Sonic Underground, but they were a little too silly or a little too broad for my tastes. Growing up, this was my Sonic the Hedgehog show. Mainly because they took such a silly premise for an easy video game and took it into some very serious and dark territory. The character designs are still cute and cuddly, but they're thrown against this near-apocalyptic backdrop, as pretty much a small group of resistance fighters have to undo the robotic holocaust that was inflicted upon their people. And Sonic could have just portrayed the typical 90s attitude teenager stereotype to a T. He even has the voice of Urkel to complement that. But they actually inject him and the other characters with a great deal of emotion, and his supporting players sometimes get as much development as he does, if not more. They took a very light and creative video game property and took in a completely different and bold direction. Propelled by a tone of adventure but still laced with a subtle environmental message, Sonic the Hedgehog Sat AM still has a strong place in my memory banks as being one of those shows that dared to try something different with a very simple premise. The Spectacular Spiderman. This is a series that I became more aware of when I was older. And even though this isn't the Spider-Man series that I grew up with, I have to say that this is by far the most well-rounded version of the character I've seen in animation. It takes very heavy influence from the original storylines created by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, but gives them kind of a modern twist. Josh Keaton's voice work as Peter Parker in Spider-Man seals the deal with regards to really portraying the angst and troubles of a teenager coming into his own as a superhero. All of the kinetic action is balanced out very well with humor, teenage love, and family dynamics. I seem to remember that this show was released right at the very end of Sam Raimi's trilogy, so Spider-Man was still very much in the cultural mindset. And there are times that the show does take some heavy influence from those movies, but for the most part it is all its own. It's just a shame that, like Sonic Sat AM, its second and final season ended on such a cliffhanger that you wanted to know what happened next. Perhaps someday we'll get to revisit the spectacular world of Spider-Man, but for now I'm perfectly happy with the 2 seasons that we did get. Futurama. Unlike its predecessor, The Simpsons, which apparently doesn't know when to quit, to the point that they'll bring these characters back just for the sake of a silly crossover, Futurama I felt was just the right amount of fun and whimsy and ridiculousness. Having the setting mainly be in the far, far future set up for some really wild and creative premises. Add to that some wickedly fun characters, including my favorite supporting character in a show, Zoidberg, and it's no wonder that people were clamoring for more after the show was prematurely pulled off the air. I'm glad the series got its chance to be resurrected a couple of times before finally calling the shots on their own finale. Because not only did the series allow for some really fun and silly scenarios, but it also was actually pretty smart with regards to some of of its science and also some of its morals. I feel Futurama hit its stride perfectly, kept a good pace, and was able to end the race as it wanted. I kinda wish The Simpsons would take a cue from that. The Max. Now at the time, sure, we had Daria and Beavis and Butthead on Liquid TV, but for me, The Max was the ultimate in just the trippiest cartoon I could see at the time. It was inspired by the Image comics, and you can feel it in every single frame that feels like they were lifted panels straight from the page. I never really knew what to make of the show as a kid, and then coming back to it as an adult, I still don't really have entirely an idea of what the journey was for Max and Julie. But just the trippy visuals, the shifts in tone and style, and honestly a very sweet relationship between the two leads, which made for some of the most iconic imagery for MTV's heyday, I feel. As much as other cartoons, like I said, Beavis and Butthead and Daria were about kind of simplicity and complex themes, this show was all about complex themes and complex storytelling, mixed in with some really complex art. Gargoyles. Again, this was a show that I really didn't keep up with when I was younger, but as I was older I was able to revisit. And I have to say, again, for a show that didn't have to be as complex as it was, Disney did a hell of a job. It was far more serious, far more darker than anything they had really tried before, having some really fun and engaging characters, including an awesome lead played by Keith David, being able to be kind of a makeshift Star Trek Next Generation reunion with its voice cast, and actually have some complex stories that were built up around mythologies of cultures from all over the world. At least for the first 2 seasons. I'll admit the 3rd season, which some consider to be non-canonical, is a little too hokey. But for what it is, Gargoyles is a pretty awesome ride. Todd McFarlane's Spawn. The Keith David train keeps a chugging along as we approach another character he voiced, undead assassin from hell Al Simmons. Now this is a show definitely intended for mature viewers. It's dark, it's dirty, it's full of drugs, violence, and sex. But it's still able to juggle all that throughout a pretty compelling story about redemption. You really do get a sense of what Spawn has lost in his deal with the devil. And when it does veer into very, very unsettling territory, it's very effective. I'd say even more so than when they were trying to do stuff in the comic books, which sometimes just seemed outlandish and cartoony. It mixed in a lot of aspects of crime, noir, espionage, and of course the supernatural element. But again, it suffered from ending its final season on a cliffhanger that was never resolved. I don't know, I guess that's an aggravating appeal to me, is this idea of all these questions going unanswered for these shows. Hey, speaking of the ultimate in unanswered questions, Young Justice. In what could have easily been a shallow imitation of Teen Titans, this show actually strived for something a little bit loftier. The characters were really well developed, the story arcs and relationships were clearly defined, and it made good use of the DC universe as a backdrop. But what really comes to mind for me when I think about Young Justice is this idea of legacy. DC has always been this company surrounding itself with the idea that mantles will be passed down to other generations for superheroics. And this show seemed to kind of really get into those themes. You have characters like Superboy, who strives really hard to understand his place in the world and also try to make his own identity in the shadow of Superman. You have Robin / Nightwing fearing that he's going to become as cold and detached from relationships and friends as Batman is. You have a character like Artemis, who has to come to grips with the fact that her heritage is not as clean cut as her partner's. And this show didn't pull its punches. It had huge world stakes. It had dark, interweaving conspiracies. Hell, characters even died a couple of times on this show. And it made Aqualad cool. That's right, the sidekick to the guy who talks to fish is a total badass in this show. But yet again, this series suffered from being canceled too quickly-itis because it didn't sell enough toys. There have been rumblings here and there of Netflix picking up a 3rd season if enough fan interest is generated in the repeat performances on the platform, and I hope it definitely comes true, because there's so much more you can tell with regards to these young heroes, and I would love to know where they find themselves next. Cowboy Bebop. I'm going to admit that I've never really been one for anime, but something about this show just hits me in all the right spots. Maybe it's something to do with the fact that this is the most westernized interpretation of an anime I've seen probably in a long while. Maybe it has to deal with the fact that it likes to touch upon all kinds of different styles and genres from all kinds of different cultures. You get a little bit of the spaghetti western, a little bit of the noir crime thriller, and a little bit of the Shaw Brothers mixed in there. Just something about these 4 bounty hunters barely getting by in the galaxy just hits me in the right way. And as the series goes on, you learn a little bit more about each character's backstory, and it makes them a little bit more three-dimensional to you. Plenty of action, plenty of humor, plenty of internal retrospectiveness. But what really seals the deal for me? The music. Yoko Kanno's orchestrations are by far the linchpin in this series for me. Everything about this show's soundtrack just gets you enthralled in each episode. Not only would I recommend this series to view in its entire 26 episode run, plus the movie, but if you can track down the score, by all means, have at it. It's worth the listen just on its own. I know people have been talking about doing a live-action remake of this series like they're gonna do with Ghost in the Shell and Scarlett Johansson, but honestly, I hope they don't. The show is fine as it is. Bruce Timm's DC Animated Universe. From Batman the Animated Series to Superman, Justice League Unlimited, Static Shock, The Zeta Project, and Batman Beyond, no other series of animation has had such an influence not just on my art style, but what I look for in good storytelling and strong character development. When Bruce Timm and company started work on Batman, they really found a way to encapsulate decades worth of the character's history into one unified vision that could seem timeless. They were able to give us what some consider to be the most iconic versions of the characters, plus throw in a couple of their own original creations to become their own icons. They were able to take the world that they created seriously, but not too serious to the point of it being joyless. Even in the darkest Batman episodes, there was a sense of some kind of fun and adventure. They didn't lose track of the fact that they would want kids to stay invested, but at the same time wouldn't want to lose the older generations. This show wasn't intending to be lofty or pretentious, but at the same time it didn't feel it had to play it down too dumb for anybody. The Timmverse, as I like to call it, always struck a very nice balance, and is still the run of shows that I find myself revisiting the most frequently. And I'm always inspired to try my own hand at similar ambitions, thanks mainly in part to this awesome world of DC heroes. So that's the McGTV Top 10 for right now. I promise next time maybe I'll have a little bit more movement involved in me. Laters!